The ideology of AI is so dominant and so idiosyncratic. The power of a handful of companies is so out of anything humanity has ever experienced that I would definitely worry about us finding the right path by just the market dynamics, which in this case means dynamics of what's going on in OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft and Apple.
So welcome, Daron. Welcome to Thought Supply by the UBS Center. I'm Joachim Voth. I'm a professor at the University of Zurich Economics Department. And Daron, who needs no introduction, is MIT Institute Professor of Economics and this year's Nobel Laureate. Welcome, Daron.
Thank you, Joachim. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you for coming. Maybe we get started by you telling us a little bit about your intellectual journey. So at some point, you grew up in Turkey and fast forward, now find yourself where you are today. Give us a little bit of a summary of what that was like, what motivated you, what moved you.
Well, that can take quite a long time. It's a 40-year history almost. But I grew up in Turkey, and I was in high school as a teenager when Turkey was going through turbulent times. It experienced a military coup in 1980 when I was just 13, and the shadow of that coup and economic problems were everywhere, and those were the things that drew me to economics or to social science more broadly. And I actually distinctly remember becoming interested in what we would today call political economy, thinking about the relationship between political events, such as the coup and the political instability that preceded it, and the economic problems that the country was having. And I decided to study economics for that reason. And I also decided to study economics abroad for that reason, that I wanted to get out of Turkey at that point. My late father was very supportive because he had spent quite a number of years in the law school during the previous very turbulent times, and he was convinced I would get myself into trouble. So I said, yeah, you should definitely go abroad. And so then started a mad dash to try to find some place, and I landed at the University of York studying economics. And then the first week or so, it became quite obvious that economics wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't worried about these bigger picture, political economy, institutions type questions. But I loved it nonetheless. And I thought the sort of effort to formalize social events, use quantitative methods, etc., was quite exciting. And I stuck with it. And only it was much later, towards the end of my PhD at the London School of Economics, where I landed after the University of York, that I thought, oh, well, now it's time to go back to think about the things that actually drew me to economics. The trigger, in fact, was a paper I came across by William Baumol about entrepreneurship. And I thought, oh, well, this is sort of talking about things that economists don't normally discuss. And this was the sort of the license for me to go back to these issues. And it sort of was fun to delve again into political economy questions now that I had a little bit more of an understanding of economics, perhaps indoctrinated, perhaps tooled up, whichever way you want to look at it. But that was the beginning of my journey into institutions, long-run economic development, and political economy questions.
Maybe just to set the scene a little bit, because not everybody was there or actually experienced it. What was economics like when you started out as an undergrad or as a PhD student?
Yeah, it's also hard for me to say because I only experienced it at the University of York, which was excellent. I think it was a great, very open environment. But, we learned economics from fairly conventional textbooks, and it was wonderful in the sense that it really built intuition about price theory, sort of various important questions of how the economy is organized, but political economy, economic history type of things were a little bit on the side. They weren't centrally integrated into economics. In fact, I remember the one course that I really did not enjoy at the University of York was a very little module on economic growth.
Okay.
Because it was just so divorced from everything. And it only, even before I got into political economy, when I went to the LSE, I retook growth courses, and then I became excited. But those sort of questions of long-run economic growth, etc., weren't sort of part of the curriculum of economics. There was an economic history course, which I enjoyed very much. It was a little bit more on the social history than the economic history part, but it was nonetheless very exciting. But it wasn't very well integrated with economics. And I think, I'm sure this wasn't uniform everywhere. There were already people in the 1980s, early 1990s, thinking about political economy questions. And in fact, another sort of paper that I read when I was a PhD student after Baumol, by the way, perhaps I should have read it before Baumol, was North End Weingast, where they talked about how the Glorious Revolution and the transition to constitutional monarchy was very important because it acted as a credible commitment to government paying its loans, and that's what changed the economic trajectory of England. I understand. I read it even when I was a PhD student. There were many criticisms of this argument on empirical grounds as well as otherwise. But again, that was the kind of thinking that I think already was there in the 1980s and 1990s. I think that paper was published in 1989, I think, or 1991, I forget. But I don't think it had made it into sort of the standard curriculum of economics.
Okay, let's change tack maybe a little bit and talk about the famous paper about colonial origins. So, recognized by the Nobel Committee as one of the main claims to fame. Maybe you can share with our viewers for a second why looking at the life expectancy of Catholic bishops in Lima can tell us something about the secret sauce behind prosperity.
Well, the trigger for that paper was, James Robinson and I were working together already, and we were doing various different things, but a lot of our work was on democracy, democratization, etc. And Jim was invited to a conference at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then after the conference, he came for us to work together. And Jim came back and he reported a talk by Jeff Sachs, which wasn't just Sachs's view, but other people's view at the time, that geography mattered because all of these countries look around the tropics, in the semi-tropical areas, were so much poorer. And then, Jim and I started discussing, and our reaction to this was, this is insane. How can you sort of ignore the fact that those countries had very, very different histories, many of them as European colonies, and you couldn't ignore that when you wanted to look at their economic trajectory. But then the question was, okay, fine, but how do you understand why it is that their colonialism was very different from, say, northeastern United States or Canada? And that's where we were sort of stuck for a while. And our approach, influenced very much by economics, was, well, to sort of cut this Gordian knot, we need a sort of source of exogenous variation, something that made European overlords, which were quite, not perfectly powerful, but very powerful in influencing the institutional trajectories of the countries that they colonized at the time, but that sort of influenced which type of colonization strategy they utilized. So we started toying around some ideas, but we didn't make much progress at first for a couple of months. And then I was giving a talk at MIT, and Simon Johnson came to my talk, and then he was very interested in what I was talking about, which was some of these political economy political transition type topics. And after my talk, we started talking, and there were some predictions about inequality, democratization, democratic stability, etc. And that's why we ended up talking for an hour or so. And Simon said, "Oh, these are so interesting topics. I would like to work on them." And I said, "Well, if you want to work on something exciting, forget about that. It's this colonial stuff that, Jim and I have been discussing. That's where I think we should put more effort."
Okay.
And then Simon and I had several more conversations where we toyed with many ideas, some of them quite wacky, some of them not so much. But that's where sort of the ideas of European diseases and mortality, etc., started taking shape. But we didn't know whether there was any data on that. And that's where Simon spent quite a bit of time and found Curtin at first. And Curtin was just Philip Curtin was a very important historian, although not so well known, but he was just so methodical, and he had studied every aspect of this problem, but from a very British point of view. So he had quite a bit of data from British and some French sources, and that became both the basis of our understanding of how Europeans thought about diseases in the colonies and data on mortality. But the bishops came in because there were big gaps in Curtin's data, and that's when we started looking for more, and Vatican records were good.
Very good. But the causal chain, the idea underlying this was that settler mortality conditioned the kind of colonial regime you set up. Either you try to attract settlers because you can or you don't, and that then influences early institutions, and that influences later institutions.
So schematically, it's very simple. From settler mortality, which we took as an excludable source of variation, and then we worried about that, but that influences early institutions. Early institutions persist and shape or influence current institutions, and then that was a source of variation for us to estimate the potentially causal effects of current institutions. Now, of course, a lot of richness exists in how settler mortality and various other conditions on the ground influence Europeans' intentions and Europeans' capabilities to do different things. We certainly, from the beginning, understood that Europeans were not very development-minded for the local economy in no place, not even in the ones where mortality was low and a number of people from Europe settled. But the more research we did there, the more the picture became a little bit clearer and more interesting, that what really was going on was often that the lower strata of Europeans who actually settled in those places could make demands and couldn't be repressed and killed as violently as the native population, and that was one of the channels via which the institutional trajectories diverged.
The paper caused a big stir, and people went over the sources, and some people actually said, if I look at this campaign in Mali, I'm not quite sure the death rates are right. But let me ask you something else. So one of the critiques that people have mentioned several times is, of course, when Europeans settle, they don't just bring institutions, right? They bring their human capital, they bring their culture. The fact that you go to Sydney and you can have tea in Fellows Row at the University of Sydney, and it all sounds very British, is no accident. So the excludability, the idea that it's just the settler mortality moving the institutions and not a whole plethora of other things, is that something that in retrospect you say maybe there's some scope to sort of think
from
that
the
that's
beginning,
true?
I think we recognized that few things in social science are perfectly clear cut. But, data sources, we wish we had much better data. But I think the patterns are very, very clear. I think nobody in their right mind thinks that Australia, northeastern United States, New Zealand were less healthy than Latin America or South Asia, and nobody in their right mind things from the point of view of the Europeans, given their complete lack of immunity to yellow fever, malaria, and a few other gastrointestinal diseases that weren't that trivial, that Africa was not deadlier for Europeans than Latin America. So I think that picture is very, very clear. So within continent variation, we can debate. I think there are some clear patterns. It is what it is. In terms of channels, there are many, many things to worry about. To be quite honest, I never worried about the human capital one. But I certainly worried about disease environment having an effect today. So that's what we spend, half of our time trying to fight against, controlling for current diseases, trying to find other experiments, etc. Europeans bringing their culture, I certainly worried about that a lot as well. Now, I think there are a couple of sort of versions of that story. One is that Europeans brought themselves and their genes. I think that doesn't actually fly because the places where there were essentially not many Europeans left after the early phases, but the institutional imprints are there, such as, for example, Hong Kong, behave very similarly. So I think the gene story isn't right. But perhaps Europeans brought some sort of culture. Well, of course, culture and institutions are not separable. So if you're bringing institutions, you're bringing some amount of institutional norms as well. So I would bundle that in. But it's clearly not, and we spend quite a bit of time on that, other aspects of culture like Protestantism, Catholicism versus other religions, etc. On the human capital story, one other thing on the culture is that actually Europeans also brought their culture in some places where they set up very extractive institutions. I think, nobody can deny that the Latin American culture is very much European influenced. And even in places like Kenya or Nigeria, Europeans really brought some aspects of their culture, at least into the capital cities. So again, I think just like institutions, how culture is brought, what aspects of the culture, how it's made sense and how it's sort of fuses with other things is the important part. On the human capital, I think that's really, to me, the least important story, because the evidence is both clear and I think also not, when you look at it the right way, is very complementary. First of all, obviously institutions work through a variety of channels: physical capital, technology, and human capital. So you expect places which have bad institutions not to invest in the human capital of the population, and they don't. So really, the human capital story that could worry some people would be the one that Europeans, when they arrived, they had high human capital already, and that is the source of the divergence. But actually, when you look at the data, the educational level of the Europeans were highest in Latin America. Those were the conquistadors that came from the elite of the Spanish country. And we look at the educational levels of the people who went to northeastern United States, they were often indentured servants, low level. And the most striking case is Australia, of course, where the settlers were convicts, not only uneducated, but also had every negative connotation that you want. So, if the germs that they brought were what they were, Australians would be all convicts today, not so highly educated people. So I really think the human capital story is the one that has least legs among all the criticisms.
Tell me a little bit more about the use of historical case studies in the context of economics.
Oh, you should tell me. You're the card-carrying economic historian. So I'm just an amateur.
I am, and I was actually visiting MIT when you were writing some of these papers, and I was stunned that mainstream economists would actually use historical evidence like this. And I think, re-legitimizing the use of historical evidence as mainstream journals and as part of general economic discourse, I think, is one of the great contributions you and Simon and Jim have made.
I hope it is so, but I've always been, from the very beginning, even as a PhD student, very opposed to boundaries, field boundaries, subfield boundaries, etc. So I think we all benefit from synthesizing a broader set of ideas and bringing a wider array of evidence onto questions. That's the spirit in which I approach economic history. I don't have a training as an economic historian. I don't have some of the great instincts of the best economic historians in terms of archival data, etc. But I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in thinking of the history of the last 500 years, and sometimes even before, as one of the most exciting times that have made our world. And it is in that spirit that I look at history as a wonderful place for us to learn some of the most important lessons. I don't think of history as, oh, if I have a question about the price of gasoline influencing, demand for cars, no, I don't think we should go back to the 1900s to look at that question. I think the reason for looking at economic history is because economic history is where some of the most interesting questions are. That's the spirit in which I think both my colonial origins paper, some of the other papers on European expansion, European effects, as well as democracy in the past have been written.
So I think there's a very important distinction here, right? So economic historians of the type that I was educated as, they want to understand the past and they use economic tools, but it's a history exercise. Whereas what you've sort of done and brought back into the economic mainstream is to say there are all these questions, and history is full of all this data and evidence and episodes that we can actually use to inform our understanding.
They are defining episodes.
Yes.
They are really transitions in social organization that are very, very important to understand. And that, was sort of obvious to me even before I wrote Colonial Origins, not just because of my own work, but other people had also done things that suggested that, if you look at the last, 80 years, there are some very, very important changes in the world, of course. But broadly speaking, the big gaps between rich and poor nations haven't formed since 1960. And they weren't there in 1500 or 1600 or 1700. So they formed sometime between 1700 and 1930 or 1940. So that is, if you want to understand income inequality in the world today, that's the period you have to study.
You're going to hear no objections from me on that. Now, there's an anecdote, probably apocryphal, that when you came up for review as an assistant professor at MIT, one of your mentors said, this political economy stuff, you should leave it to one side because you were doing a million other things, directed technological change and so forth. Is that true?
It is true, but it wasn't just one. Yeah.
Okay, so you stuck with it.
I stuck with it. Although, it did have an influence on me. I did, for a year or so, a little bit more on, just as I was coming for tenure, I did shift the emphasis a little bit, but in my heart of heart, the political economy stuff was still quite important.
I want to move on and talk a little bit about why nations fail. Maybe the first book of yours that made a really big splash. Never forget some picture of some African rebel with his AK-47 reading.
I was so happy when I saw that picture. That was great.
We're not quite sure what he was thinking, but it clearly, made a splash. And tell us more about the concept of inclusive institutions that's sort of core to the message.
I think the Colonial Origins paper, which we discussed, was super long. There was no feasible way to make it longer. But one of the things that if I look back at that paper, and I normally don't look back at my own papers, but I remember that paper. I spent so much time on it that I remember it very well. The part that's like 2 sentences or something, which should be, pages and pages and pages, is what are these good institutions? And that's one of the first things that, I started struggling right after Colonial Origins. And it did take quite a bit of my thinking when Jim, Simon, and I wrote the Handbook of Economic Growth paper on institutions. But I think the ideas about how best to think, conceptualize, started gelling in my mind after that. And that's where the label inclusive institutions came from. But I think the label really followed the conceptualization that what we wanted wasn't just some notion of secure property rights, but it was something broader than that, that enabled people to take part in economic activities in both free and level playing field manner. And that's why we started putting emphasis in Why Nations Failed in an embryonic form on things like state capacity or state centralization so that, laws can be enforced and some public institutions and public infrastructure are there in order to facilitate people's participation in economic affairs. For instance, one discussion in Why Nations Fail, which sort of captures the essence of that, and I think the essence of what we were really trying to get to with the notion of inclusive institutions is, we said, the discussion of free markets versus regulation is only part of the issue. You need inclusive markets where market participants are actually have the tools to flourish in the markets. And what those tools are going to differ from period to period. If you are in the Roman Republic period, what you need to actually be successful in a market economy are very different than in the knowledge age, but those are the things we should pay attention to, and that's what we were trying to capture with inclusive institutions.
Can I just ask a little bit about state capacity in this context? Because some people sort of feel that there's like a dichotomy between inclusive institutions on the one hand and state capacity on the others. We have the examples of, say, South Korea under General Park or Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, which are certainly not democratic. They're not sort of fully inclusive institution carrying states, but they're very capable. And then the transition to democracy and so forth comes much later. So do you see that as compatible with the core message of Why Nations Fail, or is that more sort of aberration?
So the honest answer is the following, which is that Why Nations Fail largely left out East Asia. And that was not an explicit decision that Jim and I made, but I think we knew less about East Asia than other parts of the world. And for the arguments that we wanted to make, East Asia didn't come, and China came. We had a long discussion of China at the end of the book, but there's something common about East Asia that is somewhat different. Vietnam, Korea, Japan. But we were already aware that state capacity was a very important aspect, but we didn't think about at the time, and not many people in economics did, where state capacity came from. We hopefully made a little bit more progress on that in our next book, The Narrow Corridor, which was, largely about state capacity. But I would say it also doesn't provide a full answer, because the approach of that book was that state capacity was valuable and an important element of economic growth. But we argued the most positive way in which state capacity can emerge is when it is in balance with some sort of societal control from bottom up. So I think that really makes, in my mind, an important advance over the ideas that we discussed in Why Nations Fail, or we had at the time, because a lot of that was based on research that we did between the two books. But it's, again, perhaps doesn't fully grapple with the East Asian example. And the reason for that is because there is probably something to do with Chinese influence going back to the imperial bureaucracy and some sort of ideology of the state that that makes East Asia somewhat different. So that is not fully in any of my work. But I think what's in the narrow corridor and is very relevant for this discussion is that when you look at East Asian history, which again, I'm far from being an expert, but if you look at East Asian history, at least so far as I understand it, there are periods in which that state capacity is indeed being developmental, as in Singapore, as in China in the 1990s. And there are periods in which that state capacity is really not so much different in nature, but turns completely against economic development for repression and so on. And I think even with all of the very different color and nuance of East Asia, I also still believe that, or I interpret it that way, that that state capacity, when it becomes more aligned and compatible with some sort of quasi-democratic force, it functions better. So everybody talks about General Park and that period, and that's right, there are some very important developmental states. But if you look at South Korean history, the period where economic growth really takes off is after democratization. So the pre-democratization 20 years especially are not that great for South Korean economic growth. Why? Because the chaebols are dominating the economy. They're not technological. They're making some technological investments, but it's not as dynamic as what later emerges. Some of the very inefficient chaebols are still dominating their sectors or even the economy. The military repression is putting wages down, and that changes investments and strategies at the company level. So how you use that state capacity matters even in the South Korean context.
Okay, you already mentioned the narrow corridor and this notion of the state or the government on one side and society pushing back on the other. And if they're in balance, then good things happen. And I always wonder a little bit how to conceptualize society here, or who is the government. And if I think of the images, say, from Donald Trump's inauguration, not that long ago, and you see this row of billionaires sitting right in front. It's Jeff Bezos, it's Zuckerberg. Is this society pushing back and holding accountable the powerful, or is this the beginning of oligarchy?
Oh, I think in this case, I would definitely worry about oligarchy. But the question that is deeper here, obviously, is, what is society? And we were aware, but we wanted to simplify things in the narrow corridor and the associated academic work by not going to multiple groups and stay with two groups. But society has, first of all, a division within itself, because there are people with very different intentions, objectives, aspirations within society, and also the business community, whether it is part of society or whether it's part of the elite, is itself endogenous. So if you look at some of the periods in which top-down authoritarian governments fall or become weakened, is they do face opposition from the business community. But in many other periods, whenever you talk of a repressive government or an oligarchic government, that does include the very rich. So I think definitely you have to extend that, and there have been people in social sciences before who've tried to sort of think of coalitions between broad groups. It's just a much harder thing to do, but I think that is the next frontier. In terms of the relationship between oligarchy and the state, I think my views there is it's bad when oligarchs control the state, but it's also bad when the state controls the oligarchs. So you do need a balance of power there as well. the proper gentlemanly arms of length relationship between businesses and the state, in the modern day and age, it's impossible to think that businesses are not going to have a close interaction with the state. But the question is, can that be in an arm's length way, and can that be in a way that actually has potential checks from the rest of civil society, that those checks are completely absent when oligarchs run the country, but it's also completely absent, they are completely absent when a la Putin, the dictator, runs all the oligarchs. Now in the US, which one am I more worried about? Well, when it's Elon Musk, perhaps I'm worried about oligarchy, but really my bigger worry is that Trump, with his threats, with his willingness to break norms and weaponize, different branches of government, is really scaring business leaders. And they're falling in line, and that looks much more like Putin than classic oligarchy.
I want to press you a little bit more on Trump and what it signifies and what it might herald for the future. So some people argue that we're back in the age of the robber barons of Rockefeller and Carnegie, in the incarnation of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and so forth. And this may actually lead to permanent damage to US institutions as well as prospects for growth. What's your thinking on that?
Well, I actually think that's right, but it was true before Trump. So if you look at the size of Google, Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, each one of them is 100 times the size of Standard Oil just before the antitrust case started in real terms. Those are really gargantuan companies. And they have huge social power. They've had huge social power very much under Democratic presidents as well as some Republican presidents. Their power stems not from the fact that they buy senators, like the robber barons did, but they have huge influence on newspapers, on media. They have huge influence on the bureaucracy and politicians, and they have very close connections with politicians as well. So I believe, I don't have proof, but I believe that without this sort of lopsided distribution of social power, we would not have had Trump in the first place. Trump is definitely an agent of history. People will remember him in 100 years' time. But he's also a symptom of the times that we live in. There is some deep discontent in society that has brought to power somebody like Trump. How else could it be otherwise? A healthy political system couldn't generate and empower somebody like Trump. If people weren't deeply dissatisfied with the state of affairs, they wouldn't vote for a convicted felon who had previously tried to engineer a coup. So I think we have to recognize that. So what I worry about, of course, is that either we could move to the next stage of the robber baron oligarchic equilibrium with Elon Musk especially becoming extremely powerful. There are ideas that are hugely popular, actually surprisingly popular in Silicon Valley circles that are sort of sometimes called neo-reactionary, that advocate end of democracy and empowerment of quasi-monarchs, which will be, the tech entrepreneurs, etc. So definitely we could move into a phase like that, or we could move into some sort of a Putinesque phase where Trump starts controlling the business elite. I think both of them are very dangerous.
Okay, and you think that any transition like this in the long term might actually undermine prospects for US growth?
Absolutely. I think what has happened already will have long-ranging effects on American prosperity and shared prosperity especially. I think in 20 years' time, this will not be forgotten.
Okay, so when some people looked at the first Trump term, they said it's a little bit of a hiccup and things are going to go back to normal, but you expect Trump 2.0 to basically mark a turning point.
That's right.
And is that for institutions and economic policy, or is it also for culture?
All of them. First of all, I do believe that, I did believe, and I still do, that Trump's first term was already a threat to US institutions. And we saw a coup attempt. So I don't think the previous impeachment that Trump suffered for the Russian Ukrainian affairs was a big deal. But January 6th was certainly a big deal. And Trump also deepened polarization and already started changing some norms during his first term. You know, economic and political historians in 60 years' time or 50 years' time may try to date turning points. Will it be Trump's first election? Perhaps. I wouldn't rule that out. Would it be January 6th? Perhaps. Or would it be Trump's second term? Perhaps. Or it could be actually, I would put money on as a dark horse for when Biden starts pardoning all his family preemptively, which, you know, for somebody who in 2021 argued somewhat eloquently that we needed to recreate democracy and trust in democracy, then giving pardons not just to his family but also to Liz Cheney shows that in the 4 years he became completely disillusioned with democratic institutions in the United States. If that's not a turning point, what is?
Yeah, so this goes back to your earlier point that institutions are not separate from culture, but basically
the
constitute an
norms,
equilibrium.
it's a signal. It's a signal. So in that sense, I think Trump already changed U.S. political culture, political norms, and institutions before he came to power. All of this is before he came to power the second time.
Okay, I want to pivot a little bit and talk about technological change and especially your work on new technology and AI. So there's a lot of hype about artificial intelligence. You're skeptical that it's going to make much of a difference, not going to move the needle of economic growth. Share with our listeners a little bit what the thinking is.
Yeah, so let me clarify my position. My position is not that AI cannot make a difference. I believe AI will ultimately make a difference. And I believe that AI could, even in the shorter, medium run, have a bigger impact. But my argument is that on its current path, it's not going to be a revolutionary productivity-enhancing technology in the next 10 years. And the basis for that is that for any technology to have an impact on productivity, we need a couple of things. First of all, we need them to be widely adopted. We need them to change business practices in some appreciable way, and we need them to change the production process in some appreciable and productivity-enhancing way. I think in all three of those, there are big question marks when it comes to AI. First of all, it's not, despite all the hype, and the hype is fueling it, but it's not spreading mega fast. Most businesses are not using AI yet. It will spread, but it's going to take a while. So that limits how quickly its productivity-enhancing effects can be felt. And this is not unusual. Electricity took 40 years to spread. And that was, I would say, even more revolutionary than AI. Second, the business models that a lot of money is being spent on right now have only two ways of making money. out of AI. One is digital advertising. The other one is automation, process automation. Neither of these two things are going to revolutionize productivity. Ultimately, if something like AGI happens, you could see automation could revolutionize everything. Machines could do everything humans do, or 99% of things humans do, much, much, much more cheaply. But it's not going to happen within 10 years. So therefore, we see that neither the business models are there, nor the widespread productivity revolution is going to be there. What we're going to do, most likely, within the next 5 to 10 years, is we're going to have much more effective digital advertisements. So some money is going to be made out of that. Some more companies and some more people will become multi-trillionaires or whatever. And we're going to have some processes automated or semi-automated, but those are not going to be the ones where interactions with the physical world are important. Manufacturing, construction workers, custodial stuff. To do that, you need not just really qualitative shifts in AI, but you also need flexible robotics, which is not there. It's not going to be there for 10 years. Robotics advances are coming up very slowly. I also don't think, and this here we can have a debate, that things that require very high levels of judgment are going to be done by AI within the next 10 years. So CEOs are not going to be replaced. CFOs, COOs, plant managers, psychiatrists, professors, those are still going to be around. Now, a few of them may use, like psychiatrists, may use some AI help, but it's not going to be, the job's not going to be transformed. So when you do these calculations, then you end up with about 20% of the economy where AI could have could automate or could semi-automate. But looking at historical precedents and other things, even within that 20%, things are going to be slow. So that's the main basis of my belief that I would expect with huge uncertainty, but as a median estimate, about 1% faster GDP, bigger GDP due to AI in the United States and other industrialized nations. That's big.
1% per year or
No,
1%?
1% in total. 0.1% per year. That's big.
In 10 years' time, yeah.
That's big. I mean, no, we don't have any policy, and most policymakers would kill for something that would increase GDP by 1% in 10 years. But it's not singularities here.
So Sandal Mullainathan, who was here in the first Thought Supply, likes to make this distinction between automating what people already do, we just try to clone the judgment of a doctor, and actually going beyond what humans are capable of. What he calls a bicycle of the mind, where you suddenly become much more efficient at doing something that humans themselves couldn't do. So there's AGI, there's the AI applications now that are better than any one doctor at looking at X-rays and figuring out if something is cancer and so forth. So none of these applications impresses you. You don't see that.
No. So I mean, my ideas there are extremely congruent with Sandal's. My conceptual framework, the conceptual framework I'm using here, goes back to the work that I did with Pasquale Restrepo about a decade ago, where we distinguish automation and new tasks. New tasks are important both for productivity growth and also for making sure that labor doesn't become marginalized and labor share doesn't start trending down to zero. Since then, I've been arguing that the great promise of AI is to provide better information to workers, better tools for workers so that they can perform more sophisticated tasks and new tasks, and bicycle of the mind or human-machine complementarity, what Douglas Engelbart called in the 1950s, or what J.C.R. Licklider called human-machine symbiosis. All of these are about the same thing that I'm talking about and Sandal is talking about. And with already current models, there's a little bit of that you can do, but my argument is that the current models are completely inadequate for doing that. And they're inadequate for doing that not for a technical reason. They are inadequate for doing that because the current models are not developed for that. And that's why I emphasize on the current path. So we could use a fraction of what OpenAI and Google and Anthropic are spending to create much better bicycles for the mind or more more capable information technologies to make professors, journalists, electricians, doctors more productive. We're just not doing that.
So let's talk about technology more broadly. There's a somewhat naive belief amongst many economists that technology may destroy some jobs, but people just move on to the next thing. And you're skeptical of that, right? That's the theme of your most recent book with Simon on power and progress. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, so, it's a complicated matter because I think for a long time, the economists had a very powerful contribution to thinking about technology, which was general equilibrium. So when people who don't have training in economics look at technology that, for example, does things that humans used to do in the past, they think, oh, that must be bad for humans. And reality is more complicated because of the general equilibrium. So when the railway replaces the horse carriage, it is sufficiently more productive and it integrates sufficiently more with other sectors that those productivity gains then generate new jobs. That's absolutely true. But how much of the gains get distributed, how many new jobs get created, that really depends on these general equilibrium and various different kinds of effects. And there, I think, economics rightly started with simple models. And the kind of simple models that we use a lot, were wonderful for clarifying the subtle forces. But then perhaps we become a little bit too drawn into the simplifying assumptions. So for instance, the simplest place you can start in thinking about all of these is something like what we would call a Cobb-Douglas technology, which essentially means in common parlance that marginal productivity and average productivity are proportional. But what that means is that whenever you increase productivity, in terms of average productivity, we produce more goods with the same amount of people, then that's also going to increase wages, at least in any labor market that is quasi-competitive. But Cobb-Douglas or that kind of thing is a massive simplification. Nobody actually believes that the world is a simple Cobb-Douglas technology. And many of the technologies that we're talking about are really about a wedge between average and marginal productivity. So the story that is often mentioned, it seems to have many creators, so I'm not going to assign it to anybody, is that the modern factory has two employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the equipment. So that is some people's dystopia, some people's utopia. But what it emphasizes is that in the modern factory, we could be going towards a future where there is a huge divergence between average and marginal productivity. In that factory, average productivity is very high. If you don't count the dog, okay, you can count the dog if you want, output per employee is very, very, very high. But the humor of the story is that the marginal productivity is very low. The man's only job is to feed the dog. You could easily get rid of that. So if we are going towards a future like that, then the prospects for workers aren't bright. If we are going to a future like that, now there are some countervailing effects, more complex general equilibrium forces, but by and large, a lot of workers are going to suffer. So are economists' mechanisms wrong? No, they are right. Some of those are going to come in. There will be jobs created in non-automated tasks, but they may not be enough. There is no theorem that they will be enough. As a result, and that's the framework that I mentioned a second ago, the work that I did with Pasquale Restrepo, we think that there is a race between automation and new tasks. Which one is faster is going to determine the prospects for labor and the prospects for shared prosperity, the prospects for wage labor.
And does that create a rationale for regulation, for trying to slow down technological change to some point, for things to catch up?
Not necessarily, but might. So the next step is, okay, fine. There is this race. What determines this race? So at that point, you could take an exogenous technology perspective. You can say, just like in the Solow model, Harrod neutral, or the productivity that multiplies labor's capabilities, is exogenous, just evolves by itself due to science, which is not influenced by any social forces. We could have a world in which automation progresses completely exogenously, new tasks develop completely exogenously, then there isn't much you can do. Or you could have a completely economic theory where there are profit incentives that determine the speed of automation and the rate at which new tasks are created. Or you can have a more social theory where power relations, as well as ideology, as well as market failures, are very important. So it depends on where you land in all of these things. And I think under some scenarios, I would be comfortable in saying, let the market take care of it. Under some other scenarios, regulatory options come to the table. And I think we are at a point where, although I would definitely not be sure of what type of regulations would be best, the ideology of AI is so dominant and so idiosyncratic. The power of a handful of companies is so out of anything humanity has ever experienced that I would definitely worry about us finding the right path by just the market dynamics, which in this case means dynamics of what's going on in OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft, and Apple. So, people say, I am for the market process. What does that mean? We sometimes think the market process is, firms compete. But sometimes what's going on is not that firms are competing, it's what's going on in the boardrooms of these firms. And I think it's much, much easier to be with Adam Smith. The market works. It's much harder to think that what's going on in the boardrooms of one or two companies are going to be good for the future of humanity.
Adam Smith had a few things to say about the inclination to conspire and take advantage of the public. So does all of this somehow call for a more sort of Brandeis style form of intervention by the government?
I have been always a big believer in Brandeis, that concentration is not just an economic problem, it's also a social and political problem. That is a separate argument, though. I think it's a separate complementary argument, even if the direction of technology wasn't such an important thing, which I believe it is. It's the more important thing, in my opinion. But even if it wasn't, so much concentration threatens democracy.
Very good. Now, you were telling us over lunch you have a new project on human flourishing. So tell us more. What's this about?
Well, I would say that a very important question for which I am not necessarily well qualified to answer, but I think I am semi-qualified to at least ask, is in the age of AI, which we certainly are in and we will remain in there for a while, how do we organize society so that A, we create shared prosperity, but even more importantly, we create social meaning for people. And that's what I mean. I don't know the definition of flourishing for which everybody agrees, but I think if we're going to use the word flourishing, and I sometimes hesitate using it, I think it has to have both these two components. People have to have a sense of contributing to society, have a meaningful existence, which is not just something you can achieve in and of in yourself. It has to be in your social relations, and I think it has to have something positive in your social relations that makes you feel like other people are valuing your contribution. So how do we generate that? And how do we also make sure that some of that is compensated so that people actually earn a living? I think the great fantastic, phenomenal economist Keynes was very naive about this. So when he taught about technological unemployment, and he gets kudos for thinking about that, way ahead of his time, his thinking was very naive, both in terms of what it would mean for social meaning and what it would mean for the economy. So I think he generalized from his own social milieu and thought that everybody could become an art connoisseur and enjoy, the fine living. But I don't think that's meaningful, and I don't think most people can think that they are contributing to society by becoming experts on Van Gogh. So I think, that goes back to, in my mind, to things that people like Norbert Wiener, Douglas Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider that I mentioned, and Simon and I discuss in our book, were struggling with. How do we make sure that we coexist in a positive way with machines? When they were writing, they were ahead of their time in thinking about this, but their worries were not as real because the machines weren't so advanced. Now they are.
This is a very different notion from how we think about work normally in economics, right? So work in the standard model is just a disutility. It's something you need to do in order to get the money to enjoy the consumption that you do in your leisure time. But this is really saying work is so much more and has inherent value and worth, and we should actually take this into account.
Right. For some people, it certainly is a chore, and the more meaningless we make work, the less contributing to society we make it, the more people will feel, well, I have to be here, but I really don't want to be here. But in general, for people's identity, meaning, social networks, work is important. So creating that right balance is something that's been out of the focus of economists, but I think we'll have to come back for. And you've thought about this, I know, so probably you agree, but I think it has to be integrated back into economics.
Maybe to sort of towards the end of our chat, how do you choose research topics? You've worked on almost everything, with the exception of core macro, but
right.
What is it that says to you, this is where I think the field should go, or these are the big unanswered questions?
I think in almost all instances, my work has been incremental in my own mind, in the following sense that from the very beginning, I was interested in two things: technology and institutions, especially their effects on long-run economic growth and long-run political systems. And everything else has essentially followed, either because I felt that there were some gaps in my own and sometimes in other people's as well understanding. Like, for instance, if you want to think about political economy, you have to think about networks. So that's what made me think about networks. If you want to think about technology, you have to think about its direction, and you have to think about some of the social forces, and that's what forced me into thinking about some of these social effects of technology. And sometimes, of course, real world events interfere or trigger you. So I've, of course, been working on democracy for, almost 30 years. But then over the last few years, I saw all this discontent with democracy. So that made me want to think about what determines people's support for democracy. So there will be other things. So I'm sure once it sinks in, Trump will generate more ideas or more concerns for me. But for now, a lot of what I'm doing is a continuation of this technology agenda, direction of technology, and how we can use technology better, and how we can make sure that with technology we don't destroy our democracy and our society, and thinking more about democracy, and in particular making democracy work as well. So I am still convinced that democracy is good for economic growth, and democracy is good for the right kind of economic growth. By investing in education, health, and creating enough tax revenues to invest in people. But it is also very clear that democracy is very hard work to make function, and also support for democracy is at an all-time low. In fact, even the statistics that you see, I think, are an understatement of how much crisis of democracy has set in, because we've all claimed we are democratic or we want something democratic, but the polarization and the distrust of various different types of institutions really means that people are much more discontented with democracy. So we need to sort of, from a political economy point of view, so it's both politics, history, economics, sort of see how we can make democracy work. And it's both an institutional problem and it's also a norms problem.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time,
Thank
Daron.
you, Joachim. My pleasure.
That was great fun. Thank you.
For me too. Thank you.